The air in Charleston, thick with the sweet rot of jasmine and the salt of the Cooper River, did little to mask the stench of human commerce that clung to the cobblestones of Chalmers Street. It was here, in the heart of the city's slave mart, that a boy named Cato first laid eyes on the woman who would own him. He was 10 years of age, though his body was no larger than that of a child of 4. His limbs were short and thick, his head a touch too large for his frame, but his eyes, a deep and startling obsidian, held a sharpness that belied his years and stature. They missed nothing, from the sweat stains on the auctioneer's collar to the nervous flutter of a lady's fan in the oppressive heat of 1848. He had been born on a rice plantation up the coast, a place of back-breaking labor and marsh fever. His mother, a tall, graceful woman with Gullah Geechee roots, had wept when the master's son, a wastrel with gambling debts, had declared Cato part of a lot to be sold. "You got a spirit too big for that small body, child," she had whispered, pressing a polished conch shell into his hand. "Don't let them break it." Now, standing on the dreaded block, the auctioneer's hand heavy on his shoulder, Cato clutched the shell in his pocket and kept his gaze fixed forward. He was an anomaly, a curiosity. The crowd murmured, a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. He was too small for the fields, too oddly shaped for a houseboy. He was, in the cold calculus of the market, a poor investment. Then he saw her. Ilara Drayton was not like the other women present. She stood apart from the gossiping circles of pastel silks and broad-brimmed hats. Dressed in a severe gown of dark emerald green, her flame-red hair was pulled back in a tight chignon, accentuating the sharp angles of her face. She was not beautiful in the conventional Southern sense. Her features were too strong, her gaze too direct. There was an intensity about her, a coiled stillness that set Cato's teeth on edge. She was the sole inheritor of the sprawling Blackwood Manor, a cotton plantation miles inland, a place whispered about for its isolation and the peculiar nature of its late master, her father. Their eyes met across the crowded square. Cato saw not the revulsion or the mocking pity he expected, but something far more unsettling, a flicker of intense, analytical interest. It was the look a naturalist might give a rare pinned butterfly. The bidding was sluggish, the offers insultingly low. Just as the auctioneer was about to move on, a clear, commanding voice cut through the humid air. $500. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was an absurd price for a boy of his size and perceived uselessness. The auctioneer, stunned for a moment, quickly recovered. $500 from the esteemed Miss Drayton of Blackwood. There were no counteroffers. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to seal Cato's fate. As he was led from the block, a man in the crowd spat on the ground near his feet. "What's a woman like that want with a little monster like him?" he muttered to his companion. Cato was taken to a holding pen to await his new mistress. He sat on a dusty crate, his small legs dangling far from the floor, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He had heard tales of cruel masters and crueler mistresses, of whippings and brandings. What peculiar torment awaited him at the hands of this strange, hawk-eyed woman? When Ilara Drayton appeared at the gate, the midday sun seemed to ignite her hair. She did not speak to the traders or the overseers. Her focus was entirely on him. She approached slowly, her skirts whispering over the dirt floor. "What is your name, boy?" she asked. Her voice was low and melodic, but carried an unnerving lack of warmth. "Cato, ma'am," he replied, his voice small but steady. He refused to look at the ground. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Don't let them break it." Ilara circled him, her gaze clinical. She noted the proportions of his limbs, the shape of his hands, the slight curve of his spine. It was a humiliating inspection, yet it was devoid of the usual sneering contempt. It was something else, something colder and more focused. "Can you read?" she asked abruptly. Cato's eyes widened in surprise. The question was so unexpected, so dangerous. It was illegal for a slave to be literate. He had learned in secret, taught by an old, kind-hearted stable hand who had been a preacher in his youth. He hesitated, the fear of punishment warring with a flicker of pride. "A little, ma'am," he admitted cautiously. A slow smile touched Ilara Drayton's lips, but it did not reach her eyes. "Good," she said, more to herself than to him. "That will be useful." She turned to the man holding his papers. Have him brought to my carriage. He will ride with me." The journey to Blackwood Manor was a blur of dust and suffocating heat. Cato sat on the floor of the carriage, opposite his new mistress. She did not speak to him again for the entire journey. Instead, she read from a leather-bound book, her brow furrowed in concentration. Occasionally, she would look up, and Cato would feel her gaze upon him, not as a person, but as a problem to be solved, a specimen to be catalogued. He clutched the conch shell in his pocket, its smooth, cool surface a small comfort against the rising tide of dread. He was no longer just a slave. He was a curiosity, an acquisition. He was now the property of a woman whose interest in him felt far more perilous than simple cruelty. Blackwood Manor rose from the rolling South Carolina landscape like a monument to sorrow. It was not a grand whitewashed jewel of the low country, but a severe two-story house of dark, weathered brick, almost entirely consumed by ivy. Towering live oaks, draped in funereal shawls of Spanish moss, guarded the approach, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that clawed at the perpetually overcast sky. The air here felt different, heavier, more still. The vibrant chorus of insects and birds that filled the world outside the estate's boundaries seemed to quieten as they passed through the wrought iron gates. Cato's arrival caused a stir among the other slaves. They emerged from the whitewashed cabins of the quarters, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They saw the strange, solitary mistress descend from her carriage, followed by the small, oddly proportioned boy. Whispers followed him like his own shadow, as a grim-faced house servant named Hetty led him away from the main house, not towards the fields or the stables, but to a small, secluded room at the back of the kitchen building. The room was clean, far cleaner than any space he had ever been allowed to occupy. It contained a small cot with a thin but serviceable mattress, a wash basin, and a single high window that looked out onto a walled garden. It was a cage, Cato realized, but a gilded one. His duties, he soon learned, were as peculiar as his mistress. He was not to work in the fields. He was not to muck out the stables or serve at table. His sole purpose was to attend to Ilara Drayton. This began each morning when he was summoned to her study, a vast two-story library that was the heart of the house. The library was Ilara's sanctuary, bookshelves stretched from the floor to the ceiling, crammed with volumes on botany, anatomy, philosophy, and natural history. Skeletons of small animals were displayed in glass cases, and detailed anatomical drawings of plants and insects papered the walls. In the center of the room stood a massive oak desk, cluttered with notebooks, jars of ink, and strange brass instruments. It was a room of obsessive intellectual pursuit, and it felt utterly alien to the world of a cotton plantation. "Your hands are small, Cato," Ilara said on his first morning. Without looking up from a diagram of a human skull she was meticulously copying. "You will be useful for cleaning the more delicate specimens." And so, his days were spent in the silent, oppressive company of his mistress. He dusted the bones of a Gila monster, polished the glass eyes of a taxidermied owl, and carefully wiped clean the lenses of her microscope. He was to speak only when spoken to, a rule he did not find difficult to obey. He watched her, learning her rhythms. She was a creature of rigid routine, consumed by her studies. She rarely ate, taking only small meals of bread and cheese at her desk. She rarely slept, and Cato would often see the light from her library window burning late into the night as he lay on his cot. Her obsession with him was quiet, yet all-encompassing. She would often stop her work and simply watch him, her head tilted, her green eyes narrowed in thought. She had him stand on a stool while she took precise measurements of his limbs, his torso, his head. She recorded the data in a thick ledger, her quill scratching in the silence. She made him walk back and forth, observing his gait. She examined his hands, tracing the lines on his palms with a cool, detached finger. "Achondroplasia," she murmured one afternoon, her voice a low hum of discovery. "A failure of the endochondral ossification process." Fascinating. Cato did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. He was a puzzle she was determined to solve, a biological anomaly that had, by a stroke of fortune, fallen into her possession. He was her living specimen. The other slaves kept their distance. They saw him as the mistress's dwarf, a creature set apart. Only old Jacob, the plantation's root doctor and spiritual leader, dared to approach him. Jacob was ancient, his skin like wrinkled leather and his eyes clouded with cataracts, but he saw more than most. He found Cato one evening by the edge of the walled garden, watching fireflies ignite the dusk. "She watches you, little one," Jacob said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Like a hawk watches a field mouse. Not for hunger, for the knowing of it." "What does she want from me?" Cato asked, the question that had tormented him for weeks. Jacob chewed on a piece of sweetgrass, his gaze distant. The old master, her father, he was the same, obsessed with the strange things of the world. He collected bugs in jars, snakes in boxes, filled that big room with the dead. She is her father's daughter, but her collection is different. He looked at Cato, his cloudy eyes seeming to pierce the boy's very soul. "He collected things that could not look back. You can. Be careful that she does not try to take that from you." The root doctor's words chilled Cato more than any of Alara's strange examinations. He began to understand that the threat was not to his body, but to his spirit. She wanted to dissect him with her intellect, to pin his essence to a page in her ledger, to understand and thereby possess every part of him. One rainy afternoon she called him to her desk. "You told me you could read," she said, pushing a heavy book across the polished wood. It was an anatomy textbook, filled with gruesome detailed engravings of the human body. "Read this page, aloud." Cato's hands trembled as he took the book. He stumbled over the complex medical terms, his Gullah accent thickening the unfamiliar words. "Pronounce them correctly," she commanded, her voice sharp. She drilled him for an hour, forcing him to repeat the Latin names for bones and organs until his throat was raw. It was not a lesson. It was a demonstration of her control. She was not teaching him for his own betterment, but shaping him into a more useful tool for her own pursuits. That night, as the rain lashed against the high window of his small room, Cato took out the conch shell. He held it to his ear, trying to hear the ocean, trying to hear his mother's voice. But all he could hear was the scratch of Alara Drayton's quill in the silence of her library, writing him into existence in the pages of her obsessive world. He was trapped, not by chains or whips, but by the far more insidious bonds of her fixation. The world of Blackwood Manor was divided into two distinct realms: the suffocating intellectual silence of the main house and the vibrant secret life of the slave quarters. While Cato's days were spent in the former, his soul sought refuge in the latter. As the sun bled out of the sky, casting long, mournful shadows from the live oaks, the slaves would gather. The air would fill with the scent of wood smoke and collard greens, the rhythmic thump of a drum fashioned from a hollow log, and the low melodic hum of stories and songs passed down from a forgotten continent. Initially, Cato was an outcast. He was house property, and worse, the personal pet of a mistress they all feared and distrusted. The field hands, their bodies aching from a day of dragging heavy cotton sacks under the lash of the overseer, a cruel and sycophantic man named Silas, looked at Cato's clean clothes and unmarked skin with a mixture of envy and contempt. The house slaves, led by the stern Hetty, saw him as a disruption, a strange new piece in a game whose rules they had long ago mastered for their own survival. "You best watch yourself, little man," Hetty warned him one evening as she scrubbed a pot with furious energy. "That woman ain't right in the head. She gets tired of her toys. She breaks them." Cato learned to be invisible, to listen more than he spoke. He would sit on the edge of the gatherings, a small shadow absorbing the tales of Anansi the spider, trickster tales that were more than just stories. They were lessons in survival, in how the small and the clever could outwit the large and the powerful. He listened to the songs of sorrow and the secret spirituals that spoke of freedom, of a promised land beyond the River Jordan. It was old Jacob who finally opened the door for him. The root doctor saw the boy's loneliness and the unbroken spirit his mother had prayed for. He began to call Cato over, to share a piece of cornbread or to ask a simple question. Jacob commanded a deep respect in the quarters. He was a healer, a spiritual guide, and a keeper of their collective memory. His acceptance of Cato was a signal to the others. Slowly, the walls of suspicion began to crumble. A woman named Rose, whose hands were as gnarled as cypress roots from a lifetime of picking cotton, started leaving a small piece of fruit for him on the step of his room. A young man named Samuel, who had a defiant spark in his eye and a back crisscrossed with scars from Silas's whip, gave him a quiet nod of acknowledgement. They began to see that Cato's position was not one of privilege, but a different kind of prison. They heard snippets of his life in the big house, the strange measurements, the forced readings from medical books, the long hours of silent observation. They understood that Ilara's obsession was a violation, a soul theft that was, in its own way, as brutal as a physical beating. She'd be trying to learn the ways of God, Jacob explained to the others one night, his voice low and serious as they sat around a flickering fire, trying to take apart his creations to see how they work. But a man ain't a pocket watch, and a soul ain't a gear you can pull out and study. Cato's literacy, once a source of danger and a tool of his mistress's control, became a secret asset to the community. At first, it was small things. Rose brought him a tattered piece of newspaper she'd found, and Cato, his voice barely a whisper, read her the news of abolitionist movements in the North, words that were like water on a parched land. Then came the letters. Many of the slaves at Blackwood had been sold from other plantations, torn from husbands, wives, and children. Samuel, whose fierce demeanor hid a deep well of pain, had been separated from his sister for 5 years. He knew she was on a plantation near the Santee River, but he could neither read nor write. Late one night, in the deepest shadows of the quarters, Samuel dictated a letter to Cato. With a piece of charcoal on a stolen piece of wrapping paper, Cato painstakingly formed the words, channeling Samuel's love and longing onto the page. He wrote of their mother's passing, of the birth of a new niece, of the hope that they might one day be together again. It was a sacred, dangerous act. If they were discovered, the punishment would be severe. Cato's hands, the same hands Ilara studied for their anatomical uniqueness, became a conduit for the heart of his people. This act bound him to the community in a way nothing else could. He was no longer just the mistress's dwarf. He was Cato, the letter writer, the keeper of their words. He became the repository for their secret histories, their hopes, and their sorrows. The whispers of the quarters, once suspicious and wary, now became whispers of trust and reliance. His double life was a constant strain. In the day, he was the silent, obedient specimen in Ilara's laboratory, enduring her cold, clinical scrutiny. He would recite the names of the phalanges and metacarpals for her, his voice a dull monotone. But at night, he would use those same small fingers to write words of rebellion and love, to connect families torn apart by the very institution his mistress represented. The contrast was stark and terrifying. He lived in fear of a slip of the tongue, a misplaced piece of paper, a suspicious glance from Silas the overseer. He knew that Ilara's obsession, as strange and non-violent as it seemed, was part of the same system that allowed Silas to whip a man for not picking his quota. It was all about ownership and control. Ilara sought to own his mind, while Silas sought to break his body. And in the secret world of the slave quarters, surrounded by the whispers of his people, Cato began to understand that true freedom meant fighting to keep a part of himself, his soul, that no master could ever truly own. As the years passed, Cato grew not in stature, but in the depth of his understanding. By 1858, he was a young man of 20, his body forever that of a child. But his eyes held the weary wisdom of an elder. His life had settled into a precarious balance. He was the quiet, unassuming shadow in Ilara Drayton's library, and the secret scribe of the slave quarters. But the serpent of obsession, long coiled in the dark corners of Blackwood Manor, was beginning to stir. Ilara's interest in Cato had evolved from a purely scientific curiosity into something more personal, more possessive. The entries in her ledgers, which he sometimes glimpsed upside down on her desk, were no longer just columns of measurements and anatomical notes. They now contained observations on his temperament, his moods, the way he reacted to a sudden noise, the flicker of emotion in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She was no longer just studying the condition of dwarfism. She was studying him. The change was subtle at first. She began to demand more of his time, insisting he remain in the library even when there were no tasks for him to perform. She would read aloud to him for hours, not from her anatomy texts, but from poetry, dark, romantic verses of love and loss and melancholic solitude. She seemed to be trying to mold his mind, to fill it with her own bleak and lonely worldview. "I have not loved the world, nor the world me," she would recite, her voice resonating in the quiet room. "Do you understand that, Cato? The feeling of being apart, of observing but never truly belonging." He understood it more than she could ever know, but he would only nod, his face a carefully constructed mask of impassivity. To reveal his true thoughts would be to give her another piece of himself to catalog and possess. Then came the gifts. They were strange, inappropriate offerings. A small, exquisitely tailored suit of black velvet, like a doll's costume, which he was forced to wear during his duties. A silver-tipped walking stick, scaled to his size, that felt ridiculous and mocking in his hand. These were not gifts of kindness, but of ownership. She was curating him, styling her living specimen to better fit her aesthetic. The other slaves saw the changes, and the whispers in the quarters grew more fearful. Old Jacob warned him, "She's trying to make you a reflection of herself, a broken thing for a broken woman." The true serpent, however, was Silas, the overseer. A man of brutish simplicity and petty cruelty, Silas despised Cato. He represented everything Silas could not comprehend. Cato was a slave, yet he did not work in the fields. He was small and physically weak, yet he held the mistress's unwavering attention. In Silas's mind, this was an inversion of the natural order, and it infuriated him. He watched Cato with a simmering hatred, looking for any excuse to bring him down, to prove that he was no different from any other slave who could be broken under the lash. Silas began to set traps. He would accidentally leave a tool in Cato's path, hoping he would trip. He would make loud, pointed remarks about lazy house pets whenever Cato was within earshot. Cato, skilled in the art of survival, navigated these provocations with quiet dignity, which only fueled Silas's rage. The situation came to a head in the walled garden behind the kitchen. It was one of the few places Cato felt a semblance of peace. He tended a small patch of herbs there, plants that Jacob had taught him to identify for their medicinal properties. One afternoon, as he was carefully cultivating a sprig of mint, Silas appeared at the gate, blocking the only exit. He held a small, struggling field mouse in one of his meaty fists. "Looky here, little man," Silas sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Found one of your relatives." He dangled the terrified creature by its tail. Small, weak, useless, good for nothing but being crushed under a boot. Cato stood up slowly, his heart pounding. He knew this was a test. Silas wanted a reaction. He wanted fear or anger or pleading, any emotion that would give him an excuse to escalate. "It's just a mouse, Mr. Silas," Cato said, his voice even. "It means no harm." "Neither do you, right?" Silas said, taking a step closer. The mouse squeaked, its tiny legs kicking frantically. "You just sit up in that big house playing with your books and your fancy clothes while real men work. You think you're better than us, don't you?" "I do as the mistress commands," Cato replied, holding the overseer's gaze. The simple, truthful statement seemed to enrage Silas more than any defiance. With a grunt of disgust, he tightened his fist. There was a sickening, tiny crack. He tossed the limp body of the mouse at Cato's feet. "That's what happens to useless things," Silas growled, his face inches from Cato's. "Sooner or later she'll get tired of you, and when she does, you're mine." He turned and stalked out of the garden, leaving Cato trembling not with fear, but with a cold, hard rage. He looked down at the dead mouse, a small, innocent life extinguished for a moment of casual cruelty. He understood then that Blackwood Manor was a garden of poison, and Silas was not the only snake. Ilara, with her quiet obsession and her gilded cage, was just as venomous. Her methods were different, cleaner, but the result was the same: the crushing of a spirit, the denial of a soul. That night, Cato did not go to the quarters. He stayed in his room, the image of the dead mouse burned into his mind. He took out the conch shell his mother had given him. For the first time, he didn't just listen for the ocean. He spoke into it. He whispered all his rage, his fear, and his burning secret desire for freedom into the hollow of the shell. He made a vow to the memory of his mother, to the tiny, crushed creature in the garden, and to himself. He would not be broken. He would not be a pet. He would find a way to be free, not just from Silas's whip, but from Alara's suffocating gaze. The balance had been broken. The serpent had shown its fangs, and Cato knew he could no longer afford to be a passive observer in his own life. He had to become a player in the deadly game. The incident with Silas in the garden was a catalyst for Cato. The cold rage it ignited within him did not dissipate. It solidified into a quiet, steely resolve. He realized that passive endurance was a slow death. Survival required a more active strategy. His mind, the very thing Alara sought to colonize, was his only true weapon. He began to wield it with a new, secret purpose. He started to pay closer attention in the library. He was no longer just a reluctant pupil. He became a spy. While Alara drilled him on Latin classifications and the mechanics of the human circulatory system, he began to absorb the information for his own ends. He learned about anatomy, not as an abstract science, but as a map of vulnerabilities. He read about botany, not to identify pretty flowers, but to understand which roots and leaves could heal and which could harm. Alara, mistaking his new attentiveness for submission, was pleased. She gave him more complex tasks, allowing him access to texts on chemistry and medicine. She was, in her obsessive blindness, arming her specimen. Cato learned about dosages, about the properties of mercury, arsenic, and belladonna, substances she kept locked in a small cabinet for her preservation experiments. He learned how a certain mushroom could cause violent illness and how the oil from a common garden plant could mimic the symptoms of a fever. This was dangerous knowledge, a fire he carefully cupped in his hands, waiting for the right moment to use it. His reading also gave him a wider view of the world beyond Blackwood Manor. He found an atlas and memorized the geography of the northern states. He read newspapers that Alara discarded, piecing together the growing political schism between North and South. He learned the names of abolitionists, Garrison, Douglas, and the concept of the Underground Railroad, a whisper of hope that felt as distant as the stars, but was real nonetheless. Knowledge, he now understood, was the first step toward freedom. His new purpose also deepened his connection to the slave quarters. He shared what he learned in hushed tones around the nightly fire. He told them of the world outside, of the people fighting for their emancipation. This information was a balm to their weary souls, a confirmation that they were not forgotten. He used his medical knowledge to help old Jacob. When a child came down with a croupy cough, Cato was able to identify a recipe for a syrup from one of Alara's books that, when combined with Jacob's traditional remedies, eased the boy's breathing. This earned him a new level of respect and trust, but it also put him at greater risk. Silas, the overseer, was not stupid. He noticed the improved health of the slaves, the subtle shift in their demeanor from hopeless resignation to a quiet, simmering resilience. He couldn't prove anything, but his suspicion fell squarely on Cato. The mistress's pet was having an influence he couldn't control, and it gnawed at him. Silas's surveillance intensified. He would appear suddenly at the edge of the quarters, his presence a dark cloud of menace, trying to overhear conversations, his eyes always searching for Cato. The delicate dance between Cato and Alara also became more complex. She began to crave not just his obedience, but his engagement. She would pose philosophical questions to him, seeking his opinion on matters of life, death, and the nature of the soul. If the body is merely a machine, Cato, a collection of pumps and levers as these books suggest, she mused one evening, holding a human skull in her hands, then what is it that animates it? What is this ghost that departs upon death? Cato chose his words with exquisite care. He could not reveal the depth of his own beliefs, the vibrant spiritual world taught to him by his mother and old Jacob. That was a part of himself he would never give her. Instead, he learned to reflect her own ideas back at her, to be a mirror for her bleak, mechanical view of the universe. "Perhaps, mistress," he said, his voice low and even, "it is simply that the machine has broken." His answer pleased her, confirming her own intellectual superiority and the success of her tutelage. But it was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of armor. Inside, Cato was burning with the knowledge that a person was so much more than a machine. A person was a story, a song, a community, a fierce and unquenchable desire to be free. One day, while cleaning the locked cabinet of chemicals, he saw his chance. Ilara had been called away to speak with a visitor, a rare occurrence, and had left the key on her desk. His heart hammering against his ribs, Cato unlocked the cabinet. His eyes scanned the rows of labeled bottles. Arsenic, strychnine, cyanide. These were tools of swift and certain death, too direct, too easily traced. But then he saw it. A small, dark bottle at the back, labeled Digitalis Purpurea. Foxglove. He had read about it. In small, controlled doses, it was a powerful heart medicine. In slightly larger doses, it caused nausea, confusion, and a terrifying irregularity of the heartbeat. It was a poison that mimicked sickness, a weapon of confusion and subtlety. With trembling fingers, he took a tiny vial from his pocket, one he had taken from the library discards. He carefully uncorked the large bottle and poured a small amount of the dark liquid into his vial. He sealed it, hid it deep within his clothing, and returned the main bottle to its exact position. He locked the cabinet and was wiping his fingerprints from the key when he heard Ilara's footsteps returning down the hall. He placed the key on the corner of her desk just as she walked through the door. She gave him a sharp, questioning look. "What are you doing over here?" "Dusting the desk, mistress," he replied, his voice a marvel of calm. "As you instructed." She stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes probing, searching. He met her gaze without flinching, his mind a fortress, his heart concealing its treacherous secret. Finally, she seemed satisfied and turned back to her work. Cato returned to his duties, the small vial of poison a cold weight against his skin. He didn't know when or how he would use it. Perhaps against Silas, to create a moment of chaos, an opportunity for escape. Perhaps in some other unforeseen way. But holding it, he felt a shift in the balance of power. He was no longer just a specimen to be studied. He held a dangerous knowledge, and with it, the potential to become an agent of his own fate. The oppressive heat of the South Carolina summer settled over Blackwood Manor, seeming to magnify the tension simmering beneath the surface. The cotton bloomed, white and mocking, promising another season of brutal labor for the field hands. Inside the main house, the atmosphere grew even more claustrophobic. Ilara Drayton was beginning to unravel. Her obsession with Cato had entered a new, more volatile phase. The detached scientific curiosity had been entirely consumed by a possessive, almost desperate need for control over his inner world. She had catalogued his body, she had shaped his intellect, but his soul remained stubbornly beyond her grasp. This infuriated her. She could not dissect it, measure it, or pin it to a board. Her nights grew more sleepless. Cato, from his small room, would see her light burning not just late, but all through the night. When he saw her in the mornings, her eyes were shadowed, her movements jerky and agitated. Her questions to him became more erratic and deeply personal. "Do you ever dream, Cato?" she asked him one morning, her voice unnaturally sharp. "Sometimes, mistress," he answered cautiously. "What do you dream of?" She pressed, leaning across her desk, her gaze feverish. He could not tell her of his dreams. Dreams of running, of the open sea, of his mother's face. He could not tell her that he often dreamed of a world where he could stand tall, his height not a measure of his worth. So he lied. "I dream of the things I read in your books, ma'am. Bones and stars and the orbits of planets." The answer, once again, seemed to satisfy her intellectual vanity, but a flicker of frustration remained in her eyes. She knew he was holding something back. The more he walled off his inner self, the more desperately she clawed at the walls. She began to forbid him from leaving the main house, even for his short respites in the walled garden. He was to remain within sight of the library at all times. His contact with the other slaves was completely severed. She was isolating her specimen from all external stimuli, hoping in this sterile environment to finally break through to his core. The effect was the opposite of what she intended. For the slaves in the quarters, Cato's sudden disappearance was a cause for alarm. Samuel and the others grew restless and fearful for their scribe, their connection to the outside world. For Cato, the isolation was suffocating. but it also sharpened his senses and hardened his resolve. He was a prisoner in a cage of books and bones, and the vial of foxglove hidden in the lining of his velvet suit felt heavier with each passing day. Ilara's behavior grew more bizarre. She would talk to herself, muttering long, complex sentences as she paced the length of the library. She began to neglect her appearance. Her severe gowns were often stained with ink, and her fiery hair escaped its tight chignon in wild wisps. The rigid routine that had governed her life dissolved into chaos. One afternoon, she came upon Cato as he was gazing out the library window, looking toward the distant slave quarters. Her face, when he turned to see her, was a mask of cold fury. "What are you looking at?" she demanded. "Nothing, mistress. Just the sky." "You are lying," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You miss them. The mindless chatter, the primitive songs. You prefer their company to this?" She gestured wildly around the library, at the repository of human knowledge she had assembled. "After all I have given you? After all I have taught you?" "I am grateful for my learning, mistress," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his stomach. "Grateful?" She let out a short, harsh laugh. "You are a vessel I have filled. Before me, you were an empty, broken thing. I gave you purpose. I gave you a mind. You belong to me, Cato. Your thoughts, your dreams, everything. It all belongs to me." Her outburst was terrifying in its raw, unveiled possessiveness. The pretense of scientific inquiry was gone. This was the naked, desperate obsession of a profoundly lonely and disturbed woman who saw him not as a human being, but as her last and most precious possession, the one thing in the world that was entirely hers. The thread of her sanity, already stretched taut, was beginning to snap. Cato knew that her instability made her more dangerous than ever. A predictable tyrant was one thing, an erratic one was a far greater threat. He clutched the hidden vial, its cold glass a small, hard point of reality in the swirling madness of the library. The time to act was approaching. He could not wait for her to break completely, for he did not know what form that final shattering would take, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that he would be at its center. The opportunity, when it came, was born of Ilara's own spiraling paranoia. Convinced that the primitive influences of the quarters were somehow contaminating her specimen, she ordered Hetty to stop preparing Cato's meals in the main kitchen. From now on, she declared, she would prepare Cato's food herself, in the library, to ensure its purity. She set up a small brazier and a samovar in a corner of the vast room. The arrangement was as strange as everything else she did. Each day she would brew a pot of strong black tea, which she and Cato would share. It was a ritual she seemed to cherish, a parody of civilized communion. She would pour the tea into 2 delicate porcelain cups, her hands shaking slightly, and watch him intently as he drank. "The humors of the body must be kept in balance, Cato," she would say, her voice low and intense. "I will not have your mind clouded by the greasy, common fare of the field hand." For Cato, this new ritual was a terrifying intimacy. He was forced to ingest whatever she gave him, his life literally in her hands. But it was also the opening he had been waiting for. The vial of foxglove felt like a living coal against his skin. He waited for 3 days, forcing himself to be patient, to observe the routine until he was certain of its consistency. She always prepared the tea in the same way. She always used the same 2 cups, and most importantly, she always turned her back for a few moments as she retrieved a plate of dry biscuits from a tin box on a high shelf. On the 4th day, he knew it was time. The air was thick with the promise of a thunderstorm. The sky outside the library windows was a bruised purple gray. Ilara was more agitated than usual, pacing and muttering to herself. She seemed to be arguing with an invisible antagonist. As she prepared the tea, her movements were sharp and angry. She poured the steaming liquid into the cups, the porcelain clinking with the tremor in her hands. "They think they can take you from me," she whispered, her back to Cato. It wasn't clear who they were. The abolitionists? The other slaves? The ghosts in her own mind? But they are wrong. "You are a part of me now." She turned and walked toward the high shelf for the biscuits. It was a small window, no more than 5 seconds. Cato's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he thought it would break through. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he pulled the vial from his pocket. He uncorked it with his teeth and, with a swift, silent movement, tipped its contents not into his own cup, but into hers. A single dark droplet clung to the rim of her cup. He wiped it away with his sleeve an instant before she turned back around. She placed the biscuits on the tray and carried it to the small table where he sat. Her eyes were bright with a feverish intensity. "Drink, Cato," she commanded, sitting opposite him. He lifted his cup, his gaze locked on hers over the rim. He took a sip. The tea was hot and bitter. He watched as she lifted her own cup. She drank deeply, her thirst seemingly unquenchable. She finished the entire cup in a few long swallows. For a moment, nothing happened. They sat in silence, the only sound the rising wind whistling through the eaves of the old house. Cato's mind raced. Had he used enough? Too much? Had the poison lost its potency? Then Alara's hand went to her throat. A look of confusion crossed her face. "This tea, it tastes strange," she murmured. She tried to stand, but her legs seemed to buckle. She gasped, her other hand clutching her chest. Her face, which had been flushed, was rapidly paling to a waxy grayish color. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and terror, found Cato's. In them, he saw a flicker of dawning realization. She knew. "You," she rasped, her voice a strangled whisper. She took a staggering step toward him, one hand outstretched, as if to reclaim her authority, her possession. But her strength failed her. With a choked cry, she collapsed to the floor, the porcelain teacup shattering beside her. Cato did not move. He sat perfectly still, watching her. He felt no pity, no remorse. He felt only a cold, clear sense of liberation. The great observer was now the observed, pinned to the floor of her own library, her body betraying her, the machine she so admired breaking down in violent, unpredictable ways. He calmly finished his own cup of tea, set it down, and stood up. He walked over to her prone form. She was still conscious, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her eyes followed him, filled with a helpless, uncomprehending fury. He knelt beside her, not in supplication, but in judgment. He leaned in close, his voice a quiet, deliberate whisper that was for her alone. "A person ain't a pocket watch, mistress," he said, using the words old Jacob had spoken so long ago. "And a soul ain't a gear you can pull out and study." He then stood, turned his back on the gasping, twitching woman on the floor, and walked out of the library. He did not run. His steps were measured and calm. He had tasted rebellion, and it was not the frantic, explosive act he had imagined. It was a quiet, calculated reclaiming of his own soul. The storm broke outside, the first clap of thunder rattling the windows of the great house like a round of applause. Cato walked out of the library and into a world tilted on its axis. The news of the mistress's sudden, violent illness spread through Blackwood Manor like wildfire. He was the one who raised the alarm, his voice carefully pitched to convey shock and concern. He found Hetty in the main hall, her arms laden with fresh linens. "It's the mistress," he cried, his small frame trembling with feigned distress. "She's taken a fit. She's on the floor." Hetty dropped the linens and rushed toward the library, her usual stoicism shattered. Her cry of alarm brought other house slaves running. Chaos erupted. Some ran for water, others for smelling salts. Hetty, taking charge, sent a young boy sprinting to the stables to fetch the overseer, Silas, and to have him ride for the nearest doctor miles away. Cato stood amidst the pandemonium, a small, still point in the storm. He watched as two of the larger men carried Alara's semi-conscious form from the library and up the grand staircase to her bedroom. She was moaning, her limbs twitching, her face a ghastly shade of pale. No one suspected him. Why would they? He was the mistress's pet, her constant shadow. He was the one who raised the alarm. He was just the terrified, helpless dwarf. When Silas arrived, his face was a thundercloud of suspicion and agitation. He stormed into the house, his muddy boots soiling the polished floors. His first instinct was to blame the slaves, to find a target for his rage. "What did you people do to her?" he bellowed, his eyes scanning the frightened faces of the house staff. Hetty, her back ramrod straight, confronted him. "Ain't nobody done nothing, Mr. Silas. She was took with a sudden sickness. Cato here saw it." Silas's gaze fell on Cato. It was a look of pure, concentrated venom. He strode over and grabbed Cato by the front of his velvet suit, lifting him several inches off the floor. "You!" he snarled, his spit flecking Cato's face. "You were with her. What did you do?" "Nothing, sir," Cato choked out, allowing a tremor of fear into his voice. "We were taking tea. She just fell." Silas's eyes narrowed. He was searching for a lie, a flicker of defiance. But Cato gave him nothing but the image of a terrified, grief-stricken servant. From the top of the stairs, Hetty's voice cut through the tension. "Let the boy go, Silas. You're wasting time. The doctor needs to be fetched now." With a grunt of frustration, Silas shoved Cato away from him. Cato stumbled backward, catching himself on a table. Silas turned and stomped out of the house, shouting orders for his horse to be saddled. Cato knew he had bought himself some time. The doctor would not arrive for hours, perhaps not until morning. In that window of confusion and fear, with the master of the house incapacitated and the overseer temporarily absent, the rigid structure of Blackwood Manor was beginning to fracture. He slipped away from the commotion in the main hall and went straight to his small room. He tore off the ridiculous velvet suit, a symbol of his bondage, and threw it in a corner. He dressed in the simple, rough-spun trousers and shirt of a field hand. He was shedding the skin of the mistress's pet. His next stop was the slave quarters. He moved quickly, using the shadows of the outbuildings to avoid being seen. When he arrived, the news had already reached them. A crowd was gathered, their voices a low, anxious hum. When they saw Cato, they fell silent. Old Jacob stepped forward, his blind eyes seeming to see more than anyone. "What has happened, son?" Cato looked at the faces around him, Rose, Samuel, and the others who had become his family. He took a deep breath. "The mistress is sick," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Very sick. Silas has gone for the doctor." Samuel pushed through the crowd, his face grim. "Is she—" He left the question hanging in the air. "I don't know." Cato lied. He could not tell them the truth of what he had done. It was a burden he had to carry alone. But he could give them what they needed more than truth. He could give them a plan. "Listen to me," he said, his voice taking on a new authority. "Silas is gone. The house is in chaos. We don't know when the doctor will come or what will happen when he does. This is our chance." A flicker of understanding, of hope, passed through the crowd. "A chance for what?" Rose asked, her voice trembling. "A chance to leave," Cato said. "Tonight, while the eye of the hawk is blinded." A murmur of fear and excitement went through the group. To run was a terrifying prospect. It meant leaving the only home they had ever known, facing the dangers of the swamps, the slave patrols, the dogs. But to stay meant remaining in bondage, facing the wrath of Silas if the mistress died, or the continuation of their hopeless existence if she lived. "The North Star," Samuel said, his voice filled with a desperate longing. "We follow the North Star." "I have maps," Cato said, his mind racing. "In the library. I can get them. And I took food from the pantry. We can gather what we can carry and be gone before Silas returns." It was a reckless, desperate plan. But in the oppressive world of Blackwood Manor, it was the only plan they had. For the first time, they were not just victims of circumstance. They were agents of their own destiny. The chaos in the main house had created a vacuum of power, and into that vacuum, Cato stepped, no longer a dwarf, a pet, or a specimen, but a leader. He had poisoned the root of their oppression, and now, in the ensuing turmoil, he would lead his people in a desperate, hopeful flight toward freedom. The decision, once made, sent a surge of adrenaline through the quarters. Fear was still present, a cold knot in their stomachs, but it was overshadowed by the electrifying thrill of action. They had lived their lives reacting to the whims of their masters. Now, they were making a choice that was entirely their own. Under the cover of the raging thunderstorm, which served as a perfect cloak for their movements, they prepared. The women gathered what little food they had, dried corn, smoked pork, a few precious yams, and bundled it in bits of cloth. The men sharpened knives and scythes, crude weapons against whatever dangers lay ahead. Samuel, his face set with grim determination, organized the small group of able-bodied men who would act as their protectors. Old Jacob, too frail to make the journey, gave them his blessing and a pouch of herbs to ward off fever and snakebite. "The spirits of your ancestors will walk with you," he whispered, clutching Cato's hand. Cato's task was the most dangerous. He had to return to the main house, to the library, the heart of his captivity. He slipped back through the shadows, his senses on high alert. The house was quieter now. Hetty and a few others were upstairs, attending to the still groaning Alara. The rest were huddled in the kitchen, speaking in hushed, fearful tones. He crept into the library. The room was dark, save for the intermittent flashes of lightning that illuminated the rows of books and the skeletal specimens in their glass cases. The shattered teacup was still on the floor, a testament to his act of rebellion. He went straight to the large globe stand where Alara kept her collection of maps. He found what he was looking for: a detailed survey map of South Carolina and a map of the eastern United States. He also grabbed a small brass compass from her desk. These were the tools of their liberation. As he was about to leave, his eyes fell upon the thick ledger where she had recorded her observations of him for a decade. On a sudden, defiant impulse, he picked it up. This book was the written record of his dehumanization, page after page of cold clinical analysis. It was a part of his story, and he would not leave it for others to find. He tucked the ledger, the maps, and the compass inside his shirt and slipped back out of the house, his heart pounding. He returned to the quarters, and the small band of fugitives, 12 in all, including Samuel, Rose, and 2 children, was ready. They said their tearful goodbyes to those who were staying behind, the old, the infirm, and those too frightened to run. Then, with Cato and Samuel in the lead, they melted into the stormy darkness, moving toward the back of the plantation, toward the vast and foreboding cypress swamp that bordered the property. The swamp was their best hope. The slave patrols were less likely to venture into its treacherous depths, a labyrinth of black water, twisted cypress knees, and hanging moss. It was a place of snakes, alligators, and sucking mud, but it was also a place of refuge. Entering the swamp was like stepping into another world. The roar of the thunder was muffled by the thick canopy of trees. The air was heavy and wet, thick with the smell of decay and life. They waded through knee-deep water, the cold mud sucking at their feet. The darkness was absolute, broken only by flashes of lightning that revealed a landscape of monstrous, gnarled shapes. Cato, despite his small size, proved to be an invaluable guide. His years spent poring over books had given him knowledge that the others lacked. Using the compass and the occasional glimpse of the sky, he kept them moving in a generally northward direction. He recognized edible plants from Ilara's botanical drawings and warned them away from the poisonous ones. His mind, once a prison, was now the key to their survival. Samuel was their strength. He used a sharpened scythe to clear paths through the thick undergrowth. He carried the smaller of the 2 children on his shoulders, his presence a bulwark against the fears of the others. Rose, the pragmatic mother figure, rationed their small supply of food and tended to the scrapes and cuts they inevitably acquired. They journeyed through the night, a silent, desperate procession. Every splash of water, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through them. They were haunted by the thought of Silas returning, of the baying of hounds and the shouts of the patrollers. They were running not just from Blackwood Manor, but from the entire system that had enslaved them. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the cypress canopy, they found a small island of solid ground, a hummock of earth crowded with palmetto trees. Exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud, they collapsed, huddling together for warmth and comfort. They had made it through the first night. They were free, but they were also lost, hunted, and with a long, perilous journey ahead. Cato looked at the small, weary band of survivors. The weight of his decision, the consequences of the poison he had administered, settled upon him. He had not just freed himself. He had taken the lives of these 11 people into his hands. He looked down at the ledger hidden in his shirt. He had escaped the library, but he carried its legacy with him. In the heart of the cypress swamp, surrounded by the untamed wildness, Cato's journey from specimen to leader had truly begun. Back at Blackwood Manor, the dawn brought not clarity, but deeper confusion. The doctor, a portly, irritable man named Alistair Finch, had finally arrived after a long, muddy ride. He found his patient, Alara Drayton, alive, but barely. She was weak, disoriented, and racked by intermittent waves of nausea and palpitations. Her mind, already a fragile thing, was shattered. She mumbled incoherently, her eyes wide with a terror that no one could understand. Dr. Finch examined her thoroughly. He listened to her erratic heartbeat, noted her pallor and clammy skin. He was perplexed. The symptoms were consistent with a severe cardiac event, perhaps brought on by a shock, but there was an underlying toxicity he couldn't place. "It's as if she's been poisoned," he mused aloud to a grim-faced Silas who had been hovering at the bedside. "But there's no sign of common poisons. It's most peculiar. Her constitution is strong, but her mind may be permanently damaged." Silas's mind immediately went to Cato, the dwarf, the pet, the one who was with her when she collapsed. He had felt it in his gut that the boy was involved. He stormed out of the sick room and bellowed for Cato, intending to beat a confession out of him. It was Hetty who informed him, her voice cold and flat. "He's gone." "Gone?" Silas roared. "What do you mean, gone?" A frantic search of the manor confirmed it. Cato's room was empty, the velvet suit lying in a heap on the floor. A quick, brutal interrogation of the remaining slaves revealed the horrifying truth. It wasn't just Cato. 11 others were missing. Samuel, Rose, a half-dozen prime field hands. They had run. Silas's rage was monumental. He had been made a fool of. While he was fetching a doctor for a mistress he barely tolerated, his workforce had vanished from under his nose. He knew with a certainty that burned in his soul that Cato was the ringleader. The small, quiet creature had been the serpent they had harbored in their midst. "Get the dogs," he snarled to one of the stable hands, "and round up a patrol. I want them found. I want them all found. But the dwarf, bring the dwarf to me alive. I'll peel the skin from his bones myself." The hunt began. A pack of hounds was assembled, their mournful bays echoing across the fields. Silas, riding his big black gelding, led a motley group of armed patrollers into the cypress swamp, the most likely refuge for the runaways. He was a man possessed. This was no longer about recovering property for the Drayton estate. It was personal. His authority had been challenged, his world turned upside down by a creature he considered less than human. The thought of Cato, the lettered, privileged house slave, leading a rebellion, drove him to a fever pitch of fury. He would hunt them down, and he would make an example of them that would be spoken of for generations. The price for their stolen freedom, he vowed, would be paid in blood and agony. Meanwhile, in Alara's darkened bedroom, Hetty bathed her mistress's forehead with a cool cloth. Alara had fallen into a fitful sleep. Her ravings had been terrifying. She spoke of teacups and betrayal, of a broken machine and a soul she could not capture. She kept repeating one word, one name, over and over again, her voice a broken whisper. "Cato, Cato, Cato." Hetty listened, and for the first time, she began to piece together a semblance of the truth. She looked at the woman who had been her master for so many years, a woman of sharp intellect and cold heart. She had always known there was something unnatural about the mistress's fixation on the dwarf boy. It was not kindness, it was possession. Alara had tried to own Cato's very soul, and in the end, it was a price she could not afford. Her mind, her body, her entire world had been broken in the attempt. Hetty pulled the sheet up over Alara's shoulder. There was no pity in the gesture, only a grim, weary acceptance of the inevitable, destructive nature of the world they all inhabited. The swamp became a living, breathing adversary. For Cato and his small band of fugitives, every day was a struggle for survival. They learned to muffle the cries of the children, to move with the silence of ghosts, to read the signs of the natural world. The flight of a heron indicating open water, the rustle of a water moccasin in the reeds demanding a wide berth. The gnawing hunger in their bellies was a constant companion, as was the damp chill that seeped into their bones. Cato pushed them relentlessly northward, using the compass and the sun. He knew their only hope was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Blackwood Manor, but the swamp fought them at every turn. They battled sucking mud that could pull a person down, thickets of briars that tore at their skin and clothing, and swarms of mosquitoes that rose from the stagnant water in buzzing, bloodthirsty clouds. Hope began to fray. The children whimpered with hunger and exhaustion. One of the men, a quiet field hand named Moses, fell sick with a raging fever, his body shaking with chills. Rose and Cato tried to treat him with the herbs Jacob had given them, but his condition only worsened. The greatest terror, however, was the sound they began to hear in the distance, the faint baying cry of hounds. Silas was a relentless hunter. He knew the swamp, and he was driven by a fanatic's rage. He pushed his patrol hard, ignoring their complaints about the conditions. His focus was singular: find Cato. The baying of the dogs grew closer each day, a soundtrack to the fugitives' mounting despair. It was a sound that had been bred into their bones, the herald of capture, of the whip, and of a return to a life that was worse than death. "They're gaining on us," Samuel said, his face a grim mask as they huddled together on a patch of wet ground. "We can't outrun them, not with the children and with Moses so sick." Panic began to set in. Some argued for splitting up, others for turning back and begging for mercy. Cato listened, his mind racing. He knew that splitting up would make them vulnerable and that there would be no mercy from Silas. He looked at the map, his fingers tracing the faint lines representing creeks and rivers. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form. "The water," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The dogs can't track us through deep water. The Santee River is to the east. If we can reach it, we can follow it north. It will hide our scent." It was a gamble. To reach the river, they would have to leave the relative cover of the deepest parts of the swamp and cross a more open marshland, where they would be more exposed. But it was their only chance. As they prepared to move, Moses let out a low groan. His fever had broken, but he was too weak to walk. He looked at Cato, his eyes pleading. "Leave me," he whispered. "Don't let me slow you down. Save the children." The group fell silent. The brutal calculus of survival was before them. To carry Moses would slow them to a crawl, ensuring their capture. To leave him was to abandon one of their own to a certain, lonely death. Cato looked at Samuel, and in the big man's eyes, he saw the same anguish that he felt. This was the true cost of freedom, a series of impossible choices. He knelt beside Moses, taking his feverish hand. "We don't leave our people," Cato said, his voice thick with emotion. The decision was made. Samuel and another man fashioned a crude stretcher from vines and branches. They would carry Moses. They would survive together, or they would be caught together. Their progress was agonizingly slow. The baying of the hounds grew louder, closer, more immediate. They could almost imagine they heard the crashing of Silas's horse through the undergrowth. Fear was a tangible thing, a metallic taste in their mouths. Just as the sun began to set, they broke through the last line of cypress trees and saw it. A wide, brown expanse of marshland, and beyond it, the slow silver ribbon of the Santee River. But with the sight of their salvation came a new terror. Across the marsh, not more than half a mile away, they saw them. A line of horsemen, silhouetted against the dying sun. Silas and his patrol. They had been spotted. A triumphant shout echoed across the waterlogged plain. The hunt was over. The game was up. Silas spurred his horse forward, the patrol fanning out behind him, ready to encircle their prey. For the exhausted, desperate fugitives, there was nowhere left to run. Just as despair threatened to consume them, a new sound cut through the air, sharp and distinct from the shouts of the patrol and the baying of the hounds. It was the sound of a pole pushing through mud, followed by a low rhythmic chant in a language Cato faintly recognized as Gula. From a hidden channel in the reeds to their right, a flat-bottomed boat emerged, poled by a tall, wiry man with skin as dark as the swamp water. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, but his arms were roped with muscle. He wore the simple clothes of a fisherman or a trapper, and his eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene in an instant. The terrified fugitives, the sick man on the stretcher, the advancing line of horsemen. "You in a world of trouble, ain't you?" the old man said, his voice a low rumble. His gaze rested on Cato, noting his size with a flicker of interest but no surprise. "Them crackers is coming fast. Get in the boat. Now." There was no time for questions. Samuel and the others hefted Moses onto the boat and scrambled in after him, huddling low. The boat was dangerously overloaded, its gunnels sitting just inches above the water. Cato was the last to get in. The old man dug his long pole into the muddy bottom and, with a powerful shove, sent the boat gliding out into the main channel of the river. He was surprisingly strong and agile, maneuvering the clumsy craft with an expert's skill. Silas and his men reached the edge of the marsh, their horses rearing and refusing to enter the deep water. Silas let out a roar of pure frustration, his face purple with rage. He raised his rifle and fired, the shot cracking through the evening air. The bullet whizzed past Cato's head and splashed into the water behind them. The old man didn't even flinch. He continued his steady, powerful poling, guiding the boat into the current of the Santee. They were moving faster now, carried by the river's flow, putting distance between themselves and the shore. Silas fired again and again, his shots growing wilder as his fury mounted, but they were out of effective range. The fugitives watched as the figures of their pursuers grew smaller and smaller, their angry shouts fading into the twilight. For a long time no one spoke. They drifted on the dark water, the only sound the gentle lapping of the river and the rhythmic splash of the old man's pole. He guided them into a smaller, reed-choked tributary, a secret waterway hidden from the main river. The air here was still and quiet. After a few more minutes they arrived at a small, hidden island, a mound of solid ground completely obscured from view by a curtain of weeping willow trees. A few rustic, well-kept shacks stood in a small clearing, smoke curling from the chimney of one. This was a maroon colony, a hidden community of escaped slaves who had carved out a life of freedom in the heart of the swamp. It was a place of legend, whispered about in the quarters, a sanctuary that few had ever found. The old man guided the boat to a small dock. As they disembarked on shaky legs, other people emerged from the shacks, men, women, and even a few children, their faces wary but not hostile. "My name is Titus," the old man said, finally introducing himself. He looked at Cato. "And I've been hearing whispers about you on the wind, little man. The letter writer from Blackwood who made the mistress fall down." Cato was stunned. News traveled through the swamp in ways he couldn't comprehend, a secret network of communication that connected the enslaved and the free. Titus's community took them in. They carried Moses to a shack and tended to him with skill and kindness. They gave the exhausted fugitives food, freshly caught fish and turtle stew, and clean, dry clothes. For the first time in their lives, Cato and the others were in a place where they were not owned, not hunted, not considered property. They were among their own people, a community built on the shared principles of freedom and mutual survival. As Cato sat by a warm fire, the ledger from Ilara's library resting beside him, he looked at the faces of his fellow survivors and the strong, proud faces of the Maroons. He had led his people out of bondage and, through a combination of desperation and sheer luck, had found an unlikely sanctuary. The journey was far from over, but here, in this hidden corner of the world, they could rest, heal, and for the first time, truly begin to imagine what a future of freedom might look like. The Maroon colony, which its inhabitants called Freedom's Landing, was a revelation. It was a fully functioning community, with its own leaders, its own rules, and its own culture, a potent blend of African traditions and hard-won swamp wisdom. Under the leadership of the elder Titus, they farmed small, hidden plots of land, fished and trapped in the river, and conducted cautious trade with sympathetic free blacks and even a few renegade whites on the mainland. For the fugitives from Blackwood, it was a time of healing. Moses, under the care of Freedom's Landing's healer, began to slowly recover from his fever. The others, their bodies and spirits battered by the ordeal of their escape, gradually began to mend. The children learned to laugh again, their fear replaced by the simple joys of a life without a bell or a whip to dictate their days. Samuel, his protective instincts no longer needed every second of the day, began to smile, and even to share stories of his sister, his hope for their reunion rekindled. But for Cato, the healing was more complicated. He was hailed as a hero, a clever trickster who had outwitted his mistress and led his people to safety. But the weight of his actions in the library pressed down on him. He had taken a life, or at least had shattered a mind and a body, and that act, no matter how justified, had left a scar on his soul. He spent his days helping the community, using his literacy to help Titus keep records of their trade and supplies. But in the quiet moments, he found himself drawn to the ledger he had taken from Blackwood Manor. He would sit by the river's edge and read Ilara's words, trying to understand the woman who had been his captor. He read of her lonely childhood, of her brilliant, obsessive father, who had taught her to see the world as a collection of specimens. He read her notes not just on him, but on the flora and fauna of the plantation, and he saw a mind that was desperate for order, for control, in a world that she found chaotic and meaningless. And he read the later entries, the ones where the scientific detachment bled into raw, possessive obsession. He saw her unraveling, her descent into a madness born of a profound inability to connect with another human being in any way other than as an owner to a possession. Reading the ledger was a strange and painful process. It did not make him forgive her, but it began to replace the image of a monstrous tyrant with the more complex, more tragic portrait of a broken woman. He saw that she too had been in a prison, one of her own making. Her cage was not made of laws and whips, but of her own cold, analytical intellect, which cut her off from all human warmth and connection. Titus found him there one afternoon, the open ledger on his lap. The old man sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the slow-moving river. "That book," Titus said, his voice gentle. "It holds bad spirits. She tried to write me into it." Cato explained, his voice low. "She tried to make me a character in her story. I think I took it to remind myself that I have to write my own." Titus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Freedom ain't just about breaking chains on your body, son. It's about breaking the ones they put on your mind. That woman, she tried to own your thoughts. That's the deepest kind of slavery there is. You carrying that book, you carrying her ghost with you." Titus was right. As long as he held on to the ledger, as long as he remained obsessed with his tormentor's obsession, he was not truly free. He was still bound to her, still living in the shadow of her library. That evening, as the community gathered around the central fire for their evening meal and stories, Cato stood up. He held the thick leather-bound ledger in his hands. "This book," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound clarity, "is a story of slavery. It is the story of a woman who thought she could own a man's soul by writing it down. But a soul can't be owned, and it can't be kept in a book." He walked to the edge of the fire. The flames leaped and danced, casting a warm, golden light on the faces of his people. He looked at Samuel, at Rose, at the children. Their story was not in that book. Their story was here, in this sanctuary, in their resilience, in their hope. With a final, decisive movement, he tossed the ledger into the heart of the fire. The flames licked at the dry leather, curling the edges of the pages. The ink in which Ilara Drayton had tried to define him, to possess him, blackened and vanished into smoke. The community watched in silence as the book, the symbol of his gilded cage, of the cold obsession that had defined his life for a decade, was consumed, turning to ash and rising into the vast, dark and open sky. Cato felt a profound sense of release, as if a chain he hadn't even realized was there had finally been broken. The scars on his mind remained, but they were no longer an open wound. They were a part of his history, a history he was now free to write for himself. Life in Freedom's Landing provided a sense of peace Cato had never known, but it could not quell the fire that had been lit within him. He saw the courage and resilience of the marooned community, and he knew that their small island of liberty was not enough. As long as the institution of slavery existed, their sanctuary was under constant threat, and millions more remained in bondage. His conversations with Titus often turned to the wider world. Titus, through his network of traders and contacts, had his finger on the pulse of the nation. He spoke of the growing fury in the North, of a man named John Brown, whose raid on a federal armory had struck terror into the hearts of slaveholders, and of the rising political star of an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln. "The wind is changing, son," Titus said one evening, looking up at the stars. "A great storm is coming. The whole country is a pot of water over a fire, and it's about to boil over." Cato knew he could not stay hidden in the swamp forever. His skills, his literacy, his quick mind, his understanding of the white world, were too valuable to lie dormant. The letters he had written for Samuel and the others at Blackwood had been a small act of rebellion. Now, he felt a calling to do more. He began working with Titus's network, using his ability to read and write to help the cause. He would read newspapers smuggled into the camp, gleaning information about troop movements, new laws, and the activities of slave patrols. He would then compose messages, coded in the language of Bible verses and folk tales, to be passed along the invisible railroad of communication that stretched across the South. Samuel, now fully recovered and a respected member of the community, worked alongside him. His dream of finding his sister had not faded. Cato helped him compose letters to contacts in the free black communities of Charleston and Savannah, seeking any news of her. It was a slim hope, but it was a hope they nourished together. One day, a trader brought news that sent a shockwave through the community. The state of South Carolina had done the unthinkable. It had seceded from the Union. Other states were following. The storm that Titus had predicted was no longer on the horizon. It had broken upon them. The nation was at war with itself. For the inhabitants of Freedom's Landing, the news was both terrifying and electrifying. War meant chaos and danger, but it also meant opportunity. It meant the possible collapse of the system that had enslaved them. A debate raged within the community. Some, like Titus, argued for caution, for strengthening their defenses and remaining hidden. Others, the younger and more fiery members, argued for joining the fight, for becoming guides and scouts for the coming Union armies. Cato found himself at the center of this debate. He understood Titus's caution, but his heart was with the young warriors. He had not poisoned his mistress and led his people through the swamp, only to hide, while the great battle for freedom was being fought. We have a knowledge that the Northern soldiers do not, Cato argued at a community council meeting, his voice passionate and clear. We know the swamps, the back roads, the secret ways. We know the mindset of our enemies. We can be more than just fugitives. We can be soldiers in the fight for our own liberation. His words, coming from the small man they had once seen as a helpless refugee, carried immense weight. He had proven his courage and his intelligence. He swayed the opinion of the council. It was decided that they would send out scouts, including Samuel, to make contact with any Union forces they could find, to offer their services as guides and spies. Cato's role would be to stay in Freedom's Landing, to serve as the hub of communication, the mind behind their intelligence operations. It was a role that suited him perfectly. He had spent a decade in a library, a prisoner of knowledge. Now, he would turn that knowledge into a weapon. As Samuel prepared to leave, he clasped Cato's arm. "You write me a letter to carry, little brother," he said, a fierce grin on his face. "Not to my sister this time. This one is for Mr. Abraham Lincoln. You tell him we're coming." Cato smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. The whispers he had once written in secret in the slave quarters of Blackwood Manor were now becoming a roar, a message of defiance and hope carried on the northward wind, a promise that the enslaved would not wait to be given their freedom, they would seize it for themselves. The war raged. The world that had forged Cato in its cruel fires was being consumed by a greater flame. From the sanctuary of Freedom's Landing, Cato played his part, a small but crucial cog in the vast machine of liberation. He became a master of information, gathering reports from scouts like Samuel and feeding them to Union commanders. His messages, written in his precise, clear hand, helped guide troops through treacherous swamps, revealed the locations of Confederate supply depots, and warned of impending attacks. He, who had been an object of study, was now a student of war, and a brilliant one at that. Samuel returned from his missions with stories of battle, of the bravery of the black soldiers who now fought in blue uniforms, and with news of the world beyond the swamp. He also brought something more precious, a letter, passed through a dozen hands, from a woman in a refugee camp in Virginia. It was from his sister. She was alive. She was free. The reunion they had dreamed of for so long was no longer an impossible fantasy, but a future they could dare to claim. The day the news of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Freedom's Landing was a day of jubilee. The community celebrated with song and prayer, the air thick with the joy of a promise fulfilled. For Cato, it was a moment of profound reflection. He thought of the boy on the auction block, the specimen in the library, the fugitive in the swamp. He had traveled an impossible distance. When the war finally ended, the world was irrevocably changed. The great plantations like Blackwood Manor were desolate, their fields fallow, their masters ruined. Cato learned from a passing refugee that Alara Drayton had died a year after he had fled. She had never recovered her mind, living out her last days as a ghost in her own house, endlessly calling his name. He felt no triumph at the news, only a quiet, somber sense of an ending. Her story was over. His was still being written. He did not remain in the swamp. With the war won, his skills were needed elsewhere. He traveled north with Samuel, who was finally, tearfully reunited with his sister. Cato found his calling in the burgeoning work of the Freedmen's Bureau, helping newly liberated people find their families, secure work, and, most importantly, learn to read and write. He became a teacher, standing on a small stool in front of classrooms filled with eager faces, young and old, all hungry for the knowledge that had so long been denied them. He taught them their letters, but he also taught them their rights. He taught them that their minds were their own, that their stories were their own, and that no one could ever again have the power to write them down in a ledger as a mere possession. One evening, sitting in his small room in a bustling North Carolina town, he took out a fresh sheet of paper and a new pot of ink. He thought back on his life, on the mother he had lost, on the strange, obsessive woman who had owned him, on the community that had saved him, and on the war that had freed him. He was no longer the subject of someone else's study. He was not a specimen, a pet, or a curiosity. He was a man who had claimed his own narrative. He dipped the pen in the ink, and at the top of the page, in his own steady hand, he began to write. He was, at last, the author of himself.